Hello there. This is the first in our lessons on the book of Ecclesiastes, a search for a meaning in life. This was originally presented in a Zoom class during this current COVID-19 lockdown in the British Isles, and it was presented on the 31st of March. So this is a recording of that particular lesson. The outline we're going to use for this particular lesson is one that I came up with myself. It's going to begin by looking at a consideration, the first two chapters, a consideration of wisdom, madness, and foolishness. In chapters 3 to 6, we're going to move on to look at work as well as wealth. And the idea behind these considerations is, are these the things that give us meaning in life? Are these the things that make life worth living? In chapters 7 through 10, we're going to be seeing a contrast between wisdom and foolishness. Then finally, of course, at the end of the book, we'll reach the conclusion and we'll find where the purpose of life is. This lesson, we're going to be in chapter 1, so we're going to be looking under a consideration of wisdom, madness, and foolishness, but in particular, in chapter 1, we're going to be looking at, and it's going to come really through in the text, the futility of life. We're going to begin with the first 11 verses. The first 11 verses very much is what we're going to see coming through this, is the idea that as the teacher sees it, life is just continuing on as it always has. I'm going to read the text, the first 11 verses. I'm going to read it from the New International Version. The words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors in which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south, turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, "Look, this is something new"? It was here already, long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations. Even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. As this text opens, as the book opens, we have the identification of the writer. Now, in Hebrew, he identifies himself as Koheleth. That's translated in various ways in our translations. The one I was reading from, as well as several other translations, use the term the teacher. Other translations use the preacher. The Hebrew word Koheleth probably means something like leader or speaker or teacher, or possibly a preacher of the assembly. In fact, the Hebrew title for the book is that same word, Koheleth. Our title, though, because that's obviously not our title, we call it Ecclesiastes. Our title comes from the Greek Septuagint translation, that translation of Hebrew into Greek, which took place around 200, 250 BC. Jewish rabbinic literature treats this little bit of Koheleth as a type of surname for Solomon. They refer to him as Solomon Koheleth. And they did this because his words were proclaimed in public assemblies. In fact, in particular, Ecclesiastes was read orally during the Feast of Tabernacles. Uh, the Septuagint, of course, translates Ecclesiastes, and you may be able to see it in that word there. It comes from the Greek word ecclesia, and that means an assembly or a member of an assembly. And that's where our title in English is from. Thomas Hale, in the Applied Old Testament commentary, said, the title Ecclesiastes indicates the leader or teacher is speaking before an assembly. Thus, the book of Ecclesiastes is, in effect, a sermon that explores the most important question a person can ask. What is the meaning of life? The writer goes ahead to further identify himself as the son of David, king in Jerusalem. That should leave us with no doubt about who is doing the writing. David only had one son who was king in Jerusalem. As a result of that, the author has to be Solomon. In fact, we see this again in verse 12, which we'll get to in our next section. He says, I, the teacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. Now, that to me solidifies it that the writer is identifying himself. He's saying that he is Solomon, that he is the writer of this book. Now, I hasten to add that not everybody agrees with that. Some think this was written by someone much later. Usually they point to post-exilic times after the exile in Babylon, and somebody was writing simply using Solomon's background. Others suggest, well, maybe not that late, that maybe it was written or compiled by Hezekiah and some of his scribes. Now, we do know that during Hezekiah's rule, that some of the Proverbs of Solomon were compiled, but hasten to add again, they were from Solomon. They were just taking some that hadn't been collected into the book yet. And that's identified in the text there in Proverbs. But although it was a writing technique used in ancient literature to write something claiming to be somebody else for an effect, there's no evidence that was ever employed in Scripture. Scripture views itself as being God breathed. And the idea of being God breathed is this is originating from God and the writer's writing it down, that this has God's backing behind it. Now, if that's the case, if this writing is God breathed, then it very much it must be correct in its identification of the writer as being Solomon. Looking at this as a purely human writing, then you come up with all sorts of other things. And many of the commentators go that direction. I, though, believe that this is Solomon. I believe that Solomon is writing, I think, later in life, because this is a very pessimistic view, a very gloomy picture that it paints of life. In fact, many believe that Solomon wrote Song of Solomon when he was young, and we see that optimism, and it's very much a love story, and that he wrote Proverbs in midlife. It contains advice to his son, and both are well worth our consideration. Solomon reigned somewhere around 971 to 931 BC. So I would suggest that this is probably written towards his later life. He's an old man now. He's had life experience, and he's a bit disillusioned with life. And so this probably dates from the last few years of Solomon's reign. By the way, when you read through this, and if this is written during the last few years of Solomon's reign, then when it arrives at its conclusion, and we'll see that conclusion several times throughout the book, perhaps this is indicating that Solomon returned to God before his death. If you remember, this First Kings records this, that later in life that he was involved in idolatry along with many of his wives. So maybe he did come back to God. I would like to think that. 4 fragments, by the way, of this book have been found at Qumran, part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I believe it's cave 4 that they were found in. Um, Parts of chapters 5, 6, and 7. And there was a fragment of that was in the opening screen, which I'm using uh, to open each lesson. But if you think about it, chapters 5, 6, 7, it's got 12 chapters. Those very, very much would have been in the middle of the scroll. So as the scroll disintegrated, that would have been the part that was still preserved. One thing we know from the fragments that we have, there's no significant variation from the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the text upon which our Old Testament text is based. And we have early translations of this writing as well, into Greek, of course, in the Septuagint, into Syriac a little bit later on, and into Latin a little bit later on. And these translations also give confirmation of the accuracy of the text that we have. The idea is it's not been changed, that it's consistent throughout the time period of the manuscripts that we have. But this book very much chronicles Solomon's quest in trying to find a meaning in life. In fact, I believe it's the Message refers to Solomon not as a teacher or as a preacher, but as a quester. And I think the Message gets the right idea there. It's not really a good translation of the word, but it does very much give the idea of what's going on in this book. It's his quest, his search to find what makes life worth living. Derek Kidner, in his commentary on Ecclesiastes, says we may traditionally call this man the preacher, but he stands so close to his audience that his words might seem to them the embodiment of their most radical thoughts. I think that's a good comment, because so often we sometimes feel that preachers preach at us, but the idea is this man is putting into words things that we may think, but we don't put into words. The most radical thoughts, the things that he's going to be considering as what might bring meaning to life, are things that people even today often think about as bringing them meaning in life. After introducing himself, we find really what is the theme of the book. And this theme is going to continue throughout the book. As the NIV had it, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And you can sort of hear the despair in his voice as he looks at his life and doesn't find anything worthwhile. Your translation may say something different. Just give you a sampling of some of these. The Net Bible, futile, futile, absolutely futile. Everything is futile. I quite like that one. The English Standard Version, New American Standard Version, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. I don't know about you, but vanity of vanities really doesn't do much for me. It's not a phrase that we use, whereas futile and meaningless are things that I understand. I quite like the Common English Bible. Puts the words of the Bible into the English that we use today. It translates it this way. Perfectly pointless, says the teacher. Perfectly pointless. Everything is pointless. I think that really brings home the idea here. Pointless, futile, meaningless. Derek Kidner commented, this word means a wisp of vapor, a puff of wind, a mere breath. Nothing you could get your hands on. The nearest thing to zero. That's the vanity this book is about. Meaningless, nothingness, pointless. And very much that. In fact, one translator in his own translation in one of the commentaries refers to it as being a mirage. And if you think about a mirage, of course, we associate those with being in the desert and it's hot and we're very thirsty. And it's something we see on the horizon, but never can quite get to it. We're going to see some of that coming through the text. This word for vanity or meaningless or futile occurs 38 times in this book. But the Hebrew construction is not that absolutely everything is meaningless, but as we see from what he begins to talk about, Everything that has to do with human endeavor is meaningless. He then begins to explain what he means when he says that everything is futile or meaningless. And he asks the question, what benefit do people get from all they do on the earth? Now, literally, it says under the sun there, but it's referring to life on the earth. That's a key phrase for this book. And it's interesting to me. It's only used in this book, and it's found 30 times in the book. But don't find this anywhere else in the Old Testament. But he goes on to say, as he looks at life under the sun, as life on the earth, he says, people come, people go, but they don't change the earth. Because after they're gone, the earth is still here, and it remains the same. A man named Leopold wrote this, as quoted by Danny Petrillo in his commentary. The continual appearing of new generations on the face of the earth does seem to illustrate rather forcefully man's transitoriness. One generation is always in the process of dying off, while a successor is in the process of coming on the scene. This does not mean that the author holds a cyclical interpretation of history, but it does mean that he has observed how transitory man seems to be. Isn't that the case? Humans come and go, but the earth remains. Hendry, in his bit in the New Bible Commentary, said the world assesses life in terms of profit and loss, and that is true, isn't it? But what profit can a man win that he must not finally lose? And that's going to be explored as we get into, in particular, in chapter 2 and some of the chapters after that. But, what profit is it? Because man's going to come and he's going to go. But it continues in that sort of same vein. The sun rises, the sun sets, and then it hurries to where it rises again, and on it goes. The wind goes to the south, circles to the north, round and round it goes. What's he saying in these things? Everything's in motion, but nothing new is ever accomplished. He says all streams flow to the sea, but the sea never fills up. He says to the place the streams flow, they will continue to flow. And have you ever noticed that? Sea never fills up. You have, and the streams continue to flow into the sea, and yet it never it never fills up anymore. By the way, the explanation of that, as we know, as we learned probably in primary school, is the water cycle. Streams flow into the sea. The seas, the lakes, whatever they flow into evaporates. It turns into clouds, and the clouds come down as rain on the land, and they run into the rivers and the streams. They again flow into the sea, and it goes on and on. By the way, that's an interesting concept because we didn't really get a full explanation of that to the 1700s. And yet we find it referred to here in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is, it's 900, in fact, about 2,600 years before that. In fact, you also find this explained in the book of Job as well. But the whole idea, what Solomon is saying here, I think Petrillo put it well. The earth seems permanent and stable from a worldly perspective. People come and go, but the earth remains. And as Solomon considered this, he described this as continual, monotonous activity, and it's tiresome. It's weariness. No one could bear to describe it because the eye is constantly seeing examples of it and the ear is constantly hearing about it. And what he's basically saying is this would wear anyone out. He says, as he reflects on this, what exists now is what will be. What has been done is what will be done. That there truly is nothing new on the earth. By the way, think about that. Truly nothing new on the earth. That was to a large extent true for hundreds, if not thousands of years of Earth's history, wasn't it? People did everything the same way that their ancestors did, who did it the same way that their ancestors did. Nothing really new. By the way, this would be a bit more difficult to say today, wouldn't it? That we do things differently now. In fact, since about the 1800s, we had the Industrial Revolution. In the 1900s, we had the Technology Revolution, and things have changed at a very rapid rate. But having said that, has it really changed? As Solomon says, if we discover something, it's already been done long ago. And yeah, we may be using better technology. I'm recording this using a computer and all the nice things that computers bring us. But even with a computer, we're simply doing things we did before, just in a slightly different way. We now largely self-publish what we do. We don't have to get a printer to set it out and print it for us. We can do that ourselves with our word publishing applications on our computers. But it's still doing the same thing we did long ago. Any change is minor. Any change is gradual, Solomon is saying, as to be almost not noticeable. Whatever someone might think was new, they're going to discover it's been done long ago, before their time. Derek Kidner wrote about this. He says, "There's nothing new under the sun." How strictly is it meant? How strictly does Solomon mean that? Probably our own popular use of it gives the best answer. We exclaim it as a sweeping comment on the human scene, not as a pronouncement about inventions. The more things change, the more they turn out to be the same. In their new guise, the old ways go on. And I think that's the idea there. And it goes on to say that no one would really remember anything that had happened, whether in the past or what would be done in the future. Nothing would be remembered by future generations. Petrillo put it this way. He says Solomon made two sweeping statements. Man will repeat what has been done in the past, and future generations will continue to make the same mistakes the present generation is making. And isn't that latter one so very, very true? People today are still making the same mistakes that people 100 years ago made, the same mistakes that people 200, 300, 400 years ago make. People still make the same mistakes. As you read throughout the Bible, you read throughout the New Testament, as Jesus is teaching, one thing you discover is the things that he taught about are things that we need to hear today, because people are still people. In fact, we look at what Solomon's writing here. These are the same thoughts that people still have today, some 3,000 years later. But Solomon reflects on all this. He says, all this is meaningless. It's pointless. It's futile. G.S. Hendry in the New Bible Commentary wrote, progress is ever accompanied by regress. It's only the actors of the scenery that change. The pattern of history remains the same, little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. You had a good point there. Thomas Hale in the Applied Old Testament Commentary, though, made, I think, what was a very good point for us as Christians. He wrote, the teacher was right. There is nothing new under the sun, but there is something new under the, notice that, S-O-N, under the sun. Indeed, for Christians, everything is new under Jesus, the Son of God, for it is he who makes all things new. As we consider an application for us as Christians, I think we need to consider that on the earth, in the world, there may be nothing new, but in Jesus we can have a new life, and he makes everything new for us. Continuing on, verse 12. In verse 12, down to verse 18, he's going to begin looking at wisdom. We'll comment on the wisdom that Solomon had. But I'm going to read verses 12 down to 18 as we get going. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless. A chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I've increased in wisdom more than anyone who's ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Derek Kidner, as he begins commenting on this section, says, now the focus sharpens. We turn from analogies and impressions to what we can know directly from experience. We are to scan a great spread of human pursuits to ask whether anything on earth can be found which has lasting value. So in the previous section, we were looking at some analogies. The water cycle, the wind, the sun rising and setting. But now we're going to begin looking at some very specific things. So that last section very much a preamble for the next few chapters, as Solomon's going to use his wisdom to test what gives meaning to life by examining every human activity on earth. By the way, as we begin getting into this text again in verse 12, Solomon identified himself as king over Israel and Jerusalem. By the way, keep in mind that as he began his reign, God appeared to him and God asked him what he would like as he became king, that God would give him what he wanted. And if you remember, he asked for wisdom. Wisdom so that he could rule his people wisely. And God, of course, gave him, in addition to wisdom, gave him wealth. But he decided he's going to use this wisdom to carefully and thoroughly examine all that's been accomplished on the earth. We're going to find in the next chapter he's going to use his wealth to help him in using his wisdom to examine everything that happened. The verb here in Greek, and rather in Hebrew, for examine, it can be used literally of physical action. We're going to see some of that, especially as we get into chapter 2. It can also be used to talk about figuratively of mental exploration. Thinking about something and considering it. And he's going to be doing that as well. So he's going to be examining this both physically and through his thought process to try to discover what gives meaning to life. Danny Petrillo wrote that when combining these two verbs, the basic idea is that Solomon left no stone unturned in his search. He considered his topics thoroughly, from top to bottom and side to side. He did not want someone to say, "You missed this when you were investigating." So, as Newt Heim put it in the new Tyndall commentary on Ecclesiastes, he says he conducted it with recourse to unlimited human resources and practical opportunities, having everything for its successful completion at his disposal. By the way, keeping in mind the wealth that he has no problem considering whatever he wants to consider. He does arrive at a very early conclusion. And when he looks at life, he says, God's given people a burdensome task. And again, that's been translated in various ways. Some have translated that as rotten business. He's given us a rotten business, or given us a grievous task, but just to keep us occupied. He then reflects on everything that's done under the sun, everything that man has done. As he reflects on that, his conclusion is that everything is meaningless. It's futile. It's worthless. It's like, he says, chasing the wind. The Net Bible Study Notes comments that despite everything that man has accomplished in history, it is ultimately futile because nothing on earth really changes. New Time wrote, the attempt to understand wisdom on the one hand and folly on the other is not a quest for two different things, but a genuine attempt to discover how to make wise decisions in the face of alternatives. So he's going to be looking at wisdom on the one hand and folly on the other to try to discover what's the best way to live. And initially, he just looks at and so asks the question, was wisdom and knowledge any benefit over foolishness, over foolish behavior, foolish ideas? Again, his conclusion is, well, it's like chasing the wind. Have you ever tried to chase the wind? You can't ever catch it, can you? Maybe as children we tried that and we went running after the wind. Now, the wind can do lots of damage. High winds can do extreme damage. But we never can catch the wind. We may chase it, but we won't ever catch it. And that's the idea here. It's like chasing the wind. There is no real solution to it. He says the problem with wisdom and knowledge, he says, you may know more, but that then makes more demands and gives you more responsibilities, makes more demands on you. You have greater responsibilities as a result. Isn't that true? The more we know, the more we have to do something about it. If we don't know about something, then we can't do anything about it. If we do, we can. And these, by the way, in turn, only bring us more frustration and heartache. And when we learn about, in fact, this current situation we're in, as we learn more about coronavirus, then that brings more frustration, doesn't it? As we learn, it brings more heartache as we begin worrying about whether we're going to get it. And for all we're learning about this coronavirus, it is highly contagious. It is something that doesn't discriminate. So Solomon asks, as he examines things during his lifetime, what is the point to it all? What's the point? Henry, and we'll close with this in this lesson. Henry says, the last word of human wisdom, as some of the wisest have realized, is to confess that we know nothing, that the key to the final mystery eludes our grasp. The wisdom which ends in this hole in the center must needs be vexation of spirit until it finds the wisdom that is from above, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the world unto our glory. Isn't that the truth? Yeah, human wisdom. Yeah, we know nothing. It's like chasing the wind. But you see, there is a greater wisdom. James describes this as the wisdom that's from above. That's what we need to be finding. That's what we need to be seeking and finding, because that can truly help us as we live our lives. Next, in our next lesson, we'll get into chapter 2 as he begins to look at pleasure and also begins to look at work. Do these things give us meaning in life? So I hope you can join us for that lesson as well.